Isaac, what's up? Welcome back to another interesting session of 100 Storytellers. Well, I think you all had a small break yesterday. Within the busy schedule, it's nice to have a break, right? But here we are again, ready to learn a new topic. Before we start, let me extend my gratitude to our partners. First of all, I would like to mention our official gold partner, Chartered Institute of Marketing, our media and awards partner, Arteculate Asia, and our platform partner, Curve Private Limited, for supporting us to bring this session to all of you guys. And with that, a very good evening. And now let me introduce the guest speaker tonight. Today we have Mr. Mazen Hussain, the editor-in-chief for Arteculate, to deliver a session on content writing. So, sir, it's over to you, and happy learning, guys.
Thanks so much, Shadishani, for that lovely introduction. Greetings, Isaac. Hope you're all doing very well today. So before we start, I'll just be sharing my slides here. Yep. Quick check. Can you guys see the screen?
Yeah, we can.
Yes. Awesome. So today we'll be diving into storytelling and content writing. In a nutshell, I'm going to share a few tips and tricks we've learned over the years on how you can write stuff that people actually care about. So before I start, a little quick bit about me. I've been a tech journalist for about 8 years now. Started off studying computer science, actually, but then decided to pursue my love for storytelling. Ever since then, I've been helping innovators explain how technology works for regular humans and help them effortlessly succeed in this digital world we live in. I worked across many different digital mediums, from blogs to podcasts to video, and led teams to tell a few impactful stories. And currently, I'm serving as the editor-in-chief at Arteculate Asia. Now, let's dive into storytelling. And I think we're in a very fascinating time in human history to be a storyteller. Particularly if you go back a few, maybe 50 or even 100 years ago, not too far back. This is really the time of our grandparents, actually. Back in those days, the only people who could tell a story were those with a printing press, actually. But today, things have dramatically changed. If you go back just 10 years ago, when Facebook and Twitter and everything came onto the scene, one of the founding principles that these founders had, like particularly Mark Zuckerberg, was he threw this question: what if we gave everyone, every single human being on the planet, a printing press? What stories would they tell with it? And 10 years later, of course, we've seen how social media has exploded, where each and every one of us today is a storyteller. And it's like George Lucas really says in this amazing quote here: digital technology today allows us to have a much larger scope to tell stories. And really, social media is the ultimate example of this. Today, you can whip out your phone, just turn on the camera, and just instantly tell your story to the entire internet and the entire world. But now comes the question: what makes a good story? And that's what we're going to be diving into today. But the very first and most fundamental thing, I would say, in my opinion, of what makes a great story is passion. Do you have the passion to tell the story you want to tell? And as you can tell by now, I'm a huge Star Wars fan. Now, if you go back to 1971, when Star Wars was just coming out, nobody thought it would be the big cultural phenomenon it is today. Not even George Lucas himself. Everyone thought that, hey, this is gonna flop. This is some weird sci-fi thing. It's probably not gonna work out. But truth is, we've all been proven wrong on that. Anyone who's had that statement has been proven wrong. Star Wars is the perfect example of how if you have that passion, you really can go out and tell a story, because telling stories is hard. I'm not going to lie. That's something I want you to understand. Telling stories is hard. It's grueling. You're going to face a lot of challenges. And ultimately, it boils down to having the discipline, but also the passion that's going to drive you in telling that story. You'll realize discipline will help you write about 10 pages of the story you want to tell, but passion is where those 10 pages will come to life and really help your readers understand and be immerse themselves and get lost in the world that you are trying to create. So we're going to be diving into the nitty-gritties now, but remember, the foundation of what a great story is built on is passion. If there's one thing you're going to take away from this session, it's this. Now, from here, we're going to be diving into content writing, particularly from the school of journalism. Now, when it comes to content writing, there are many different schools of thought like advertising, movie writing, script writing, and so on. And I'm going to share a few tips and tricks from journalism, which, as Philip L. Graham says, is the first rough draft of history. And you'll find that these fundamentals we carry in journalism will translate into the other schools of writing that you might find yourselves involved in down the line, whether it is later on you want to tell a story as a movie, whether you want to tell it as a novel, or heck, maybe even as a series of Instagram stories. These lessons will definitely help you. Now, within journalism, we say there are two types of stories. The first is short stories, which we use for very quick updates, just to pass some basic information out there, which can be like a quick breaking news alert, or it can be like a few listicles, such as, let's say, for example, 3 ways to start your day more energized and motivated. The other type of stories we have is in-depth feature stories. This is where within journalism, it means taking the time to deeply analyze whatever has unfolded, what's happening in the world, and give a deep and clear, crystal clear, full picture of what's unfolded. So for example, here in this slide, I've taken the example of the coronavirus, which we're currently living through. So an example of a short story is, hey, we found this weird new coronavirus. We don't know what it is, but it's happened, so stay tuned. And then an in-depth feature is when we dive into what happens if you get infected. Like, what do you do then? Why are these first few days so important? So that's the two types of stories we have. There's the short, quick stories and the in-depth feature stories where you take your time and try to offer even greater value to the people, to your audience. Now, in telling any kind of stories, you should be truthful, especially in the modern world. I cannot stress this enough, where because everyone now has a printing press, it's also so easy for misinformation to so quickly spread. So to quote Walter Cronkite, in seeking the truth, you have to get both sides of any story that you are telling. So what does that really mean? Research, lots and lots and lots of research. Even if you're writing a fictitious novel, like a sci-fi novel, research is still very much important. I can share an example of one of my close friends. His name is Naveen Veeraratne. He's a Sri Lankan sci-fi author, and you should check out his books. I can't recommend them enough, but he spends about at least 60% of the time he dedicates to writing his books to simply researching. That's how important it is. Even if you're creating your own imaginary world, people will want some bits of realism around it. So you got to know, research and know what works and what doesn't work. But how do you go around researching? Here's 3 simple steps that we adopt at Arteculate, which is, first off, start off with the simple, very fundamental, basic questions to just get an introductory understanding of the topic. These questions sometimes might seem stupid to that, and you might feel that way, asking that, especially from an expert. But don't be shy of asking these stupid questions. It's like the old Chinese saying, a person who asks a stupid question is a fool for only a minute, but the one who doesn't ask it is a fool for life, really. From there, you go to the second part of this, which is, who is it relevant for? Now, when you're doing your research, this bit is where you try to understand your audience. Now, who exactly are you trying to reach? Are you trying to reach business leaders? Are you trying to reach teenagers? Are you trying to reach young adults? Are you trying to, let's say, reach people who go to the gym on every single day? Having this answer helps frame your story on who exactly is reading it. By knowing who is going to consume your story, you're able to refine it and ensure you're able to give them what they want. And this is a very crucial step I cannot stress enough, because there's a lot of stories out there and not all of them are great. And honestly, it's because they fail this one step, which is trying to figure out, okay, what is it that my audience wants? So before you even start writing your first word or first paragraph, get to know who your audience is. Once you know that, it's time to go in depth. Go and speak to the experts on the topic, get to know more about it, start learning more, and then you'll start filling in the blanks to tell your story. So to summarize, research is 3 steps. Starts off with the simple questions, figure out who your audience is, and then finally, dive in deep. Now that you've got your research, it's about writing. So when it comes to writing your story, there's a lot of nitty-gritties that you can get into, a lot of rules and a lot of language. And you're probably going to be exploring those later on. And if not, there are hundreds of courses out there. But to offer you guys a starting point, I would say that whenever you're writing a story, remember that there are 3 things you need to keep in mind. First off is your opening. This is your introductory first 2-3 paragraphs where you try to explain to your readers, why should I care about what you've just written? Think about it. A person who is scrolling through Facebook will see about 100, 200 articles at any given time as they scroll through. So why should they invest their valuable time reading or really consuming any type of content you create? Your opening is the answer to that question. If you do not have them within what research says, within at least the first 3 seconds at most, some would say even less than half a second, you have a very limited time. So you got to make sure your opening is impactful to answer the question, why should I care about this, for your audience? The next thing is your body. Now that you've hooked them in, this is where you give them their time's worth. You dive into the different aspects of your story and your topic and really explain to them what you're talking about. Try to use subheadings or break it down into different sections so that it's easier for them to digest and you're more sure that your information has actually reached them, they've understood it. And then when they come to the conclusion, where you can give your summary and share your honest thoughts around it, they can form their own thoughts and now act upon it. So in summary, whenever you're writing a story of any type, the three things you need to have are an opening, a body, and a conclusion. Now, writing, as tough as it may sound, is actually the easy part of storytelling. The hard part is editing. Now, when it comes to editing, here are the three things that I personally look to in every story that goes out on Arteculate. The first thing is transitions. 90% of a good article or even a good video, a good podcast, or even a good set of stories on Instagram is transitions. It's how you flow from one point to the next. If you start off, for example, by talking about cars in one point and then suddenly go into horses, hold on. That doesn't make sense. One moment you're talking about a vehicle, now you're suddenly talking about animals. Where's the link? You got to give your audience that link. So let's say you were talking about cars and specifically about how they are not environmentally friendly, and then move on to, okay, let's take a look at what we had before cars. Before cars, we were going around horses. These were theoretically more environmentally friendly, but back in the day, we assumed they weren't so much because, well, their horses are horses, and the streets were quite messy back then. So right now, you've currently made a transition from where the link is you're talking about greenery, where you talk about protecting the environment. The next thing is readability. Now, once you've gotten your transitions ironed out, it comes down to readability, which specifically means how simple and easy is it for someone to consume your content if they're either listening to it or reading it, or even just viewing it. The golden principle is KISS, keep it simple, stupid. And that's how Trump really got elected. If you go back to not the recent US election, but the one before that, Trump's motto was "Make America Great Again." In contrast, all his rivals did not have a slogan like that. They had something very complicated that nobody even remembers today. But what Trump said is still remembered because it's so easily understood. Even a 3-year-old child can understand it. And that is the power of readability. It allows you to reach so many audiences. I know a lot of us might think that, especially when you go into university, where we might end up using a lot of jargon and so on, it might make us look and seem smarter, especially that's what our lecturers would say. But in the real world, let me assure you, this is a study done by Harvard itself. The more jargon you use, the more complicated words you throw in to however you speak or write, you actually sound stupider because nobody can understand you anymore. So remember the golden rule, KISS, keep it simple, stupid. And finally, grammar. No matter what medium of storytelling you use, grammar is your deadliest rival. Check for typos, unwanted spaces, keep your pronunciation proper if you're doing video or audio, because the moment somebody catches bad grammar, they will 9 out of 10 times on the internet, just the way it is, they will rip you apart. So just try to double check and triple check again for grammar errors. So just going back, we saw in writing, the 3 things you need to keep in mind are your opening, your body, and your conclusion. After that, when you go into editing, keep an eye on your transitions, keep things simple with readability, and keep an eye on your grammar. Now that you've created your piece of content, the next important thing is your title. Like Frank Train says, next in importance to books are their titles. You can have the greatest book in the world, but contrary to popular belief, people do judge a book by their cover. And in the case of the internet, they judge a link by its title. So how do you find a good title? So you start off by keeping it to the ideal length. The optimal title researchers found is 8 to 12 words long. Don't keep it too short, but feel free to go longer. Secondly, don't be shy to make a statement. People click links that they believe will invoke a response. Sorry? And next up, like after you've got the headline where you make a strong statement, try to throw in some known faces and brands. People like to know what they're familiar with. And when it finally, of course, the right words. Now, this might sound vague, but it boils down to simply try to limit the use of positive language as much as possible, but don't go overly negative into clickbait trying to scare people. That's actually dangerous and will work against you. But also try to avoid passive language. Don't be shy. Make a hard statement with your titles, and you'll be sure that anybody scrolling through the Facebook feed will check out whatever you've created. And this especially applies to anybody who is telling stories in text, like with content writing. Be sure to use media with images, YouTube videos, podcast links, so on and so forth, infographics. Don't be shy. Our attention spans are shortening. So when you put these rich images and so on into your stories, they actually help better communicate what you're trying to share with your audience. So use a lot of images as much as possible. A golden rule that we use is every 3 to 5 paragraphs, try to at least keep one really good quality picture there, or a video, or even a blog quote or something, just to give your readers a visual break from what you're saying. So that's about content writing. So from school journalism. So from here, we'll be diving into storytelling. But before that, if anybody has any questions right now, I'm open before we continue here. Feel free to drop them in the chat. All right, sensing none at the moment. So let's dive into storytelling. Now, when it comes to storytelling, you want your writing to be great, and good writing is supposed to invoke sensation in the reader. Now, when we want to look at how to tell mind-boggling stories, one of the first things I would share is you have to be focusing on the human element. So this lady's name is Margaret, and she has a very fascinating story. She is the lady behind the computers that actually allowed the Apollo moon mission to succeed. Without her, Neil Armstrong would have never made it to the moon. And her story is a great example of the power and really why we should be telling stories. Her story has inspired countless women to pursue science and even join NASA to make even more greater feats of science possible. So how do you really go about telling great stories? We looked at how it is you can go about content writing, but how do you go beyond that to tell impactful stories that matter? So I'm going to take a few rules from Pixar here. Now, Pixar has this great set of rules, about 22 of them, on great storytelling. A lot of them apply to fiction, which is if you're making a movie, I'd recommend you definitely go through all of them. But I'm going to pick a few things that would apply if you were covering real world stories as well, kind of like what we do in journalism. First off is the audience. You got to keep in mind that what's interesting to you as a writer versus as an audience member are completely different thing. And this goes back to research, where you have to speak to the audience you're trying to reach, figure out what interests them and what is it that they're always keen to want to know. What type of stories do they want to hear? Quite often, it can be very different from what you want to do as a writer or any type of content creator. But as a storyteller, it's important that you know what your audience wants if your story is to succeed. Secondly, the struggle. Typically, we admire characters for trying more than their successes. And this is something we recognize a lot at Arteculate with our stories about entrepreneurs. I personally have met a lot of people who come to me and tell me that the stories that have inspired them the most is the stories where we've written about people that have struggled and overcome challenges. And really, if we look at a lot of individuals that inspire us, we admire them for not the success on its own, but really for overcoming the struggle that they face to get to that success. Next up, when you're telling a story, be sure to inform your audience what the stakes are. What exactly happens if your characters don't succeed? Make it clear. Let's say, in our case, of course, if we're talking about startups or companies and entrepreneurs who are trying to build their own companies, the question then becomes for us to ask, okay, what would happen if the entrepreneur failed at that point in time while they were building their company? What if they failed? Like, what if they didn't get, enough customers? What if they ran out of money and so on? Some have told us that they would have really shut down the company if it didn't succeed and just try to move abroad to hopefully get a better job if they were luckier. And it's these little elements that you have to throw into your story. Like, yes, you have to show the struggle, but you also got to keep it in the audience's mind that, hey, if they fall at this point in time, it's all going to be for nothing. This is what's going to happen if they fail. So be sure to communicate the stakes as well. And another rule is the ending from Pixar, which is that come up with the ending before you have the beginning or your middle. Honestly, I agree with Pixar here. Endings are really, really hard. And it's good to work on them up front. So you have a clear mind of, okay, where is it that I want to go? Where is this journey going to take my audience? Where is it going to take my readers? Where is it going to take my listeners? Where is it going to take the people watching this video? So having that ending in mind really helps a lot when you're having those blocks as a creator to figure out, okay, what's next? How do I get to that ending? Now, once you have that ending, of course, and you formulated your story, go back to square one. It's important to try for a theme, as Pixar said, but this is another rule I really agree with Pixar, which is that you never truly know a story until you actually reach the end of it. An example that I can give is that for about the past 6 months, I was working on a story about gaming in Sri Lanka, which is about the gaming community itself, the community of players of video games we have here in Sri Lanka. And I knew at the ending, I want to talk about, okay, we have the normal players, they have their own challenges, but then we have competitive players, and at the same time, we have those who are making their own video games. But once we did the research, we wrote it from end to end, a lot of things changed. What was suddenly just a single article turned into a series of three or four articles covering everything because there was so much more. And that's the thing. When I started, I assumed this would be just a single one-off thing that'd be about 3 to 4 pages, but it turned into 10 or 20. So when having that ending, of course, really helps. But remember that as you go through the journey, you yourself will learn what the story is. So don't be afraid to go back and rewrite. And as you are rewriting that story, remember your why. Again, this goes back to my point about passion as well. When you're having a story, it's crucial that you're passionate about telling that story. And with keeping that passion, which is fleeting. Passion is truly fleeting. You wake up one day super motivated to achieve your goals, and within the afternoon, that motivation is gone. To keep that flame alive, it's good to know why you want to tell that story. Why is it that you want to tell this particular story to the world? And for me, it was, if I go back to this story about gaming, it was that there was so much happening. There's such a vibrant community. Like the rest of the world talks about their vibrant community. Why not Sri Lanka? Why not, hey, we are on par with everyone else. So let's tell that to the rest of the world. And on the days that you don't have that motivation, having this why really, really helps in keeping you going forward on that journey to actually tell your story. We just saw now Pixar's rules on how to tell a story. And if you want to learn more, I encourage you to check out Pixar's 22 rules of storytelling. But as we as we're mindful about what makes a great story, it's equally important to be mindful of exactly what can destroy a good story. And two things are making it unnecessarily complex. Remember, kids, keep it simple, stupid. Don't go overboard by trying to make things unnecessarily complex. Again, you're going to sound stupid. Don't force your readers or listeners, or even anybody who's viewing a video, to need to have a PhD to understand what you've created. Like even this image, like I don't even understand it, to be honest, and that's why I thought it was perfect. Like I'm guessing it's something to do with Schrodinger's cat here, but I don't know. And that's the point. You want to keep something simple, like with this next image where you can see, okay, it's something, you're seeing something really passionate about gamers here, like people who are really happy. And this is actually from that story I told about, which is, with this picture really helped me to avoid forgetting my why. Again, when you lose your why and you lose your passion, it's really reflected upon your stories. I've personally put out a few stories that I wasn't too passionate about, and each time I was always given a gut punch, a reminder of why I shouldn't do that. Because when you're not passionate about your story that you're telling, your audience really senses it, and they're not going to be interested to even check it out. So always keep your why and never forget that. Like keep it written down if you want, but if you're losing your passion and if this is not filling up, remember, at that point your story is gone. Well, we've seen some of the things on how to tell stories. We've looked at content writing, but let me ask you now, you might be wondering, why is all this important in any form? Because stories have power. Stories that we tell have the power to shape and change the entire world that we live in. The story that you want to tell could shape the entire world. It could be a reason why some kid is motivated to get out of bed when they're depressed and go to school. Or it could be the story that sparks a giant conversation that brings justice to a group of oppressed people. To quote Robert McKee, storytelling is the most powerful way to put ideas into the world today. And if I were to pick one example, actually, I'm going to give you a few examples. You know what? Not sticking to one. This is Ida Tarbell, who was a journalist in the early 1920s. Now, Ida Tarbell was a very, very fearless journalist who went after the big monopoly companies at the time. She took on the big trusts who controlled practically every aspect of the US economy. And they controlled everything, including the papers, politics, but that didn't stop her. She went from town to town and took the stories of the workers and how they were oppressed, because at the time this included, factories where children were working and they were at great risk, not just from diseases and like the chemicals that were in the air, but also the machines themselves were dangerous. And it wasn't uncommon for children to lose a finger or two, and the factory would say, eh, get back to work. Those were the cruel conditions that existed just a few hundred years ago, like not too far back. And the reason they changed, one big reason was because of Ida Tarbell. Her stories really told the masses just how horrific, it helped them understand just how horrific the working conditions were and how companies were just being plain evil because there was nothing to stop them. There were no laws or anything. So if you want to know the reason why we have laws protecting the quality of our food to make sure that it's healthy and edible, to why we have a weekend, to why working hours, like why we have overtime pay and why working hours do go beyond 5, you can thank Ida Tarbell for all that. It's because of her that we today, 100 years later, are talking about work-life balance and not so much how do you survive at work. That's the power of her, how her stories changed the world. If you want another example, this is another story from exactly 100 years ago, which is the Tulsa Massacre. For you might not have heard of this because for years historians have tried to bring this story to light. The Tulsa Massacre was a racial riot in the US where there was a street area in Tulsa called Black Wall Street where the African American minority were very different from everywhere else. They were rich, affluent, they had their own businesses, they were empowered, really. But then in one day in 1921, a mob had just destroyed this entire community. And now all that exists is a highway. And it was, as the pictures you see, was very terrifying. And even the plane you see in the background, that happened. There were planes dropping bombs. And nobody knew about this for about almost 100 years until just last year when the Watchmen series showed a scene from that reenacted these horrific event. The searches for the Tulsa Massacre just shot up after that one episode from the Watchmen, and it was mind-blowing. For decades, historians and the victims was trying to seek justice. And then after seeing this story vividly reenacted in The Watchmen, everything changed. There's been congressional hearings to ensure the victims got the justice they were denied for so many years. And even just a few hours ago, Joe Biden was the first president to, even in the US history, to actually acknowledge and accept this was unacceptable. This was a horrific event. It took 100 years for the victims of this tragic event to get justice. And it was because of this one scene in a story that changed everything. And if I take one more example from locally, it's the 2017 floods. I'm not sure how many of you might remember the time because it's a footnote and really we go jumping from one crisis to another these days. But at the time, we were covering this very closely. And for me personally, it was awe-inspiring because as a nation, we were seeing all these pictures and videos of our fellow countrymen suffering through these floods. And we as a nation really got together, each and every one of us took whatever we could and donated, like with whatever supplies we could, went to the supermarket, donated anything we could to these victims to help them get back on their feet. These pictures and videos we saw on social media, we got to know their story. We saw the story of their suffering, and it changed everything. We as a nation came together. And that's really the power of storytelling, which is that if you, from all these examples, you can see whatever story that is that you want to tell, go ahead and tell it, because it has the power to change the world. Stories are what drive change in this world we live in, because we as humans, we're not geared to, process facts or scientific research or any of data like that. We are very emotional creatures, and we live on stories. So whatever story it is, I'm going to take one more rule from the Pixar rulebook, which is finish your story and let go, even if it's not perfect. It's easy to get stuck trying to create the perfect story, but it's really hard. It's very challenging, but the best option is tell your story and just do better next time. Remember, if you write one story, chances are it may not be great, but if you write 100 stories, then the odds are probably in your favor. And that's pretty much it from my side. So if anybody has any questions right now, I'm open to taking them.
Thank you, Mr. Hussain. Actually, like you just injected the whole idea about storytelling into our mind, just like another story. Especially the facts that you brought out from history was like so inspiring. Thank you for that. And with that, dear delegates, if you have any questions, please do ask them right now. We have an expert here with us here today. So shoot out all your questions. You can unmute yourself and ask, or else you can drop a chat. Drop your questions in the chat box as well. While they are like formulating their questions, I would like to give another announcement as well. As we talked about in the induction, and as you all are aware about it already, we have a competition called 1000 Startup Story Initiative, which is organized by Arteculate Asia, and we would like all our delegates to put their effort into this. The rules are already available in the WhatsApp group, and we had so many questions about these competitions from our delegates. So if you have any questions regarding that also, we will be glad to address them. We have many guests from Articulate here today, so maybe they will be able to give you a clear picture about the competition. So yeah, we have questions in the chat box now.
Yep, I'm seeing. So one is from Chaitana. So to get the first 3 elements of content writing, it's have an opening, a body, and a conclusion. Your opening is, in simple terms, answering why your readers should care about your content. Your body is where you dive into the story itself, where you talk about the different points. And your conclusion is, if it's an informational piece, offer a summary and your own thoughts. So think of it like wrapping a gift. Basically, that's the ribbon around it. And if beyond that, of course, remember, that's only one part of the equation. Then there's editing, which is transitions, readability, and keeping an eye on good grammar. So Chaitana, I hope that answers your question. Feel free to throw a follow-up. Next up is Nimuthu on how to overcome writer's block. Okay. Yeah, this is actually, I think, one of the biggest challenges that every writer faces. So what I do with writer's block personally is that I tend to take a break, but before that, I try to write down and list in bullet points the basic facts of the story or where I'd like it to go. Just put it down there, because once you put it down on paper, sometimes it helps But generally, of course, if it doesn't help you then and there, just take a break and then try to come back to it, because you're just stressing your brain if you're just trying to, get past it, like trying to bulldoze it. It's better to save your mental energy and then come back, and you will see, okay, this is how I can reorder those bullet points to get to that ending I want. Remember, having your ending greatly helps also in overcoming the writer's block there. So Nimuto, I hope that answers your question, but feel free to throw a follow-up if you have any there. So I'm seeing a few more. Hold on. Yeah. So this is from Dilsha. Is there any website or database we could look into know more about ideal storytelling and content writing? So if I think more than a website or a database, this is my personal opinion, which is that if you really want to improve your talents as a storyteller, start consuming more stories, but have a critical eye on your stories. Like, let's say you're reading a novel, and this is actually how I passed my O-level English paper, which was that I just studied Harry Potter, really. Like, it was more keeping an eye on how J.K. Rowling herself, like, describe different scenarios and what words she used to describe different emotions and so on. So when you start looking at how different writers are framing different things, you start getting your own ideas on how you yourself can communicate those ideas as well. So yes, if you want a website though, there's plenty of courses on Coursera that teach this very academically. But if you want to go beyond the academics, try to just start off by looking at some of the stories that you read very critically, and you'll start getting a clear idea there. So see, there's another one okay, this is from Shehan. As a journalist, how does one determine the amount of controversy to be included in a certain article according to the audience, topic, and message you're trying to convey without compromising of the aforementioned? Yikes. Okay, so thanks, Shehan, for putting me in the hot seat. I love these challenging questions when they come through. And in terms of controversy, so personally, I don't try to be controversial purposefully. And I think any journalist who tries that is, well, I'm being a bit harsh here, but is trying to basically get cheap clickbait out of it. It's easy to stir up controversy if you go around twisting and turning around the facts unnecessarily with almost anything. But that being said, there are controversial topics. And when it comes to deciding what's the right amount of controversy to include, I would say don't focus on the controversy itself, but rather focus on the facts, focus on the hardcore facts and getting the real truth out there. Because as a journalist, I think the best way to describe the job of a journalist is this. If two politicians tell you that it's raining outside and the other one says it's not, your job isn't to just report what both say. Sure, in Sri Lanka, you might report what both say, but your real job is to actually look out the window and decide whether it's raining or not and who's telling the truth. So controversy will always be part and parcel of journalism, but I would say, focus on the facts, not so much on the controversy itself, and you will be truthful and honest to your readers. And even if it's not your readers, even if it's on TV and video, the same would apply, I would say. So Shehan, hope that answers the tough question you gave there. Right, so Next up is Ahmed's How to Overcome Laziness on Journalism. Oof. Yeah. Okay. So I have to confess this is probably, I think it's a guilty thing for all of us. Like each of us, we are all very human, and we do hit those moments where we're tired and run out of energy. And I think when it comes to creative writing on any form, even when it's journalism itself, a good way to bulldoze ahead is having that discipline. Because, like I said, motivation is very fleeting, but discipline is what keeps you going even when you don't have that motivation. So sometimes you might not have the luxury of taking a break in journalism, because especially with breaking news, like we have zero time for ourselves. So we have to break that news and inform our readers. So really, it's something you build over time, but it starts with you saying that, okay, look, I am going to get started on this. I'm going to do it. And I'm going to take a baby step now. I'm going to write one word, one sentence, one paragraph. One word, one sentence, one paragraph. And from that point, when you start telling yourself that, it takes a long time, but eventually you will be able to get through that barrier and pursue it, because ultimately the best antidote to laziness is discipline. So I hope that answers that question. So have another question from Chetna, which is regarding the competition. So feel free to drop us an email, of course, which is like my personal email is mazen@articulate.asia. Alternatively, you can, if you have any detailed questions, of course, feel free to shoot them to the ISAC committee and they can compile it and send to us, and we will give you the full details about the competition there.
We too have a question from the OC. We believe that you shifted to journalism from computer science background.
Yes, I did.
Many of us are like eager to know how you made that transition.
Okay, so the transition wasn't so hard actually. So prior, like while I was still in uni, I was doing some writing also on the side. And then because I think it also greatly helped, like when we are covering, we decided to focus startup Articulate and focus on technology, because the reason we started Articulate really was that we saw there was a lot of tech companies in Sri Lanka doing some amazing work. It was on par with the Googles, the eBays, and so on, but nobody was talking about it. And whenever anybody tried talking about it, they really misunderstood it. So we thought, okay, look, we know how to write and string a few words. And at the same time, we do understand tech. So we said, hey, you know what? Let's try this out. So we started off as a blog, but then decided, okay, look, there's a real burning need for this. So we decided to, hang up our coats as software engineers, where I was software engineer for a very brief time, and said, you know what, let's go all in on this, because this is probably the place where we can make a great change. So I think from the OC, that might answer the question there.
Yeah, I got disconnected for a while, but I believe it answered the OC.
Okay, so Adishan, just for you, it was that, okay, I'm just going to keep it really summarized. So we saw great things were happening in tech. We decided, okay, we can make great change here. So we decided to start Articulate, and the rest is history.
That itself is a really nice startup story to hear. And yeah, so delegates, if you have any more questions, please feel free to ask.
Yeah, and also
we have a very professional and
yeah, and just to remind for everyone, if you want to know more about Articulate or even specifically details about the competition, beyond me, you can also reach our team at hello@articulate.asia. So I'm just going to put that in the chat here, so everyone can just take a note of it. Yeah. So if anybody else has any tough questions, like feel free to throw them at me. Like, I love the questions you guys are throwing at me so far.
While they are again processing their question, I have another question for you.
Sure.
So whenever I try to write, I have this mind block. Like I come up with an idea, and maybe I don't have time. And then when I come back to the idea again, when I have time to start writing, I start questioning about my idea, whether this is right, whether it's a nice one, shall I write about it, shall I not, is it worth? So how do you handle, do you ever feel that, and how do you handle it, sir?
I think for me, the question is, when do I not feel that actually? Because what you're describing is actually very common, Adishani. Like, because it helps because now having that why when you start off really is a guiding light, but it's also equally important to know, keep especially in mind of your audience, because sometimes the why may change over time because of just how the world works. So it's okay to keep coming back and saying that, okay, if this story doesn't work and if you don't have the passion for it, at that point, I would say that it's time to make that really hard call to either shelve that story or drop it. Because if you try, you can definitely certainly try to bulldoze ahead and, with discipline, get that story out there. I've done that a few times, but each time that I have, from my experience, it just blew up in my face because your audience will really see the difference between a story where you have put your heart and soul in versus a story you just wrote for the sake of writing. It's very visible in the words you use and how your points connect and how everything flows. The readers can easily sense it. So it's not right for you to waste the time of your readers. I would say that as any content creator, you have a duty to your audience to give them value back for the time that they have invested in you. If they even give you even a minute, you have to make sure that they feel, wow, that was a great story. Even though I listened for a minute, I enjoyed it thoroughly. So you have to create that wow effect that for the time that they give you. So if you feel that, okay, after you come back to a story, even after you've written down the points and everything, and you feel, okay, this might not work out, shelve it and come back to it maybe again on a later date. But even again, if you feel this may not be right, then it's time to drop it and maybe pick another story. But when you pick a story, start. As once you start, of course, things become a lot clearer and you're probably going to get closer to the finish line.
Thank you for that. And we have another question in the chat.
Okay, so how can I increase my creativity and become a good storyteller? Because sometimes you might feel a copy of existing well-known stories and not my own creation. So this is from Chetana. And really, if you very critically dissect any stories, even the great works by, let's say, the greatest filmmakers, like those from Marvel movies, or even the classics like Interstellar or Titanic, nothing is really truly original. There's only a handful of stories in human history that can be said to be truly, honestly, 100% original. Even Shakespeare's great works of art that we spent studying in literature classes, those were based off of, stories of real events. And it's okay to go and pick apart. Like, this is what Steve Jobs says: good artists copy, but great artists steal. And really, if you take a look at all of Apple's creativity into innovating great products. Nothing they do can really be said to be new, but it's the way that they do it that makes all of their customers really love it. I mean, I'm not an Apple fan personally, but it's very visible when you speak to an Apple fan, the passion that they have for the brand comes from, okay, yeah, sure, Android may have done it many years ago, but sure, Apple does it just in a different way. So as a storyteller, if you want to increase your creativity, go ahead and consume all the stories out there and feel free to take what you feel worked amazingly well from those creators and incorporate them into your own stories. Eventually, over time, you'll start getting your own ideas as well. And that's okay. So don't worry about having imposter syndrome, which is what you might be feeling, Chaitana, because all of us really deal with that every single day.
Okay, we have another question. This is again from the OC. How
Right.
to reach to target audience and find some professional topics which can trend in current context.
Okay, so that's like,
View.
okay, now that's a challenging question, like from the OC, like props to you guys. Like that's like multiple questions in a question there. So, but really, okay, when it comes to all of this, first and foremost is trying to understand your audience. So that means reaching out to the people. Let's say you start a Facebook page or something like that for your stories. Pay attention to the people, who are liking, commenting, especially if they are not your friends and family. Your first few viewers might come from your friends and family, but eventually they will come from people that are not directly connected to you. So when you start seeing these people regularly come, try to reach out to them, like maybe even as a comment, say, hey, thank you for liking, and get to know why they're following you. So as you start interacting with these people, you get a greater understanding of your audience. From once you have this understanding, everything else becomes so much easier. Like you will know, okay, what social networks are they active on? Like, are they active on Instagram? Are they active on Facebook? Or is it LinkedIn? Like you will start understanding that. Then, okay, this is where I have to put my story if my audience is to see it and if I have to reach them. And from there also, you will figure out what their interests and things that they're passionate about are. After that, you can figure out, okay, what are the topics that they will want to do really, get to know about. So it all starts with understanding your audience, but there are also tools like Google Keywords and things like Facebook Analytics or Google Analytics that help make this process slightly easier. Yes, these tools can be, little helpful if you're able to get around the technicalities, but the most effective tool way that we have found and Articulate is going out and actually speaking to the people that come to us and say, hey, we read your story. And when you speak to those people, yes, you learn a wealth of information.
Thank you for that. And one more question from the OC, if you don't mind.
Okay, I'll take that, but we have one from a delegate here. So just give them. So from Hasini, sometimes we escape from some grammar rules to be more creative. Will that also definitely give our story a bad influence? I don't know. I think that's a question for your audience to decide. And sometimes, of course, when you're breaking the rules, I think first and foremost, it's important to know why a certain rule exists. Like, let's say the Oxford comma, which exists to really help separate, different elements. It's like bread, butter, jam, and tomatoes. So if you typically how the Oxford comma would be is like just before the end, before jam, you would put after jam, you put a comma there so that people know it's clearly jam and tomatoes. Whereas if you omit this rule called the Oxford comma, as some schools of grammar do, it can in some context where it's easy to get twisted, it might say tomatoes made out of jam or something like that. So whenever you're breaking the rules of grammar or writing, just be mindful why that rule was created in the first place. When you're knowing why certain rules exist, then it's easier to break them because you can better gauge and be more mindful of the impact that they will create. But ultimately, I don't think just breaking a rule would make a story bad. The rules exist for a reason, but if your audience judges that your story is good because you broke the rule, then it's not a bad story. Ultimately, the decider of whether a story is good or bad is really on our audiences. So, Hasani, I hope that answers your question there. Feel free to throw a follow-up. So, Ashan, now back to the question the OC had.
Yes. So if you have to name a single content creator or a writer who inspires you a lot, who would it be? And how do you take these inspirations to work on your own work, to create your own work?
Okay, so if it's any one person that I have to pick that's really inspired me, it's Brandon Stanton, who is the photographer behind Humans of New York. So what I really find inspiring about him is that we see all these really human, personal stories on the Humans of New York page. But what I really found awe-inspiring was that not just the stories themselves that he brings out, but the fact that he's able to bring them out in a short conversation with another human being that he meets maybe for the very first time. Now, as journalists, of course, we are always constantly meeting people and interviewing people. And for me, I think what inspires me about him is that I'd like to challenge myself to be that comfortable to when another human being is speaking to me, so that they feel that they can trust me and be open. So as a content creator, I think that's essential, especially when you're trying to create a story with another human being out there. They have to be able to trust you so that you also can tell a very honest story that involves them. And I think that's essential. And honestly, Humans of New York proves just how powerful it is when you have that trust. So yeah, it's all Brandon Stanton there.
Thank you for answering that. And I think we have few minutes left before we wrap up. So delegates, if you have any more questions, you can shoot them now. And while they are putting down their questions, we can also turn on our cameras and get ready for the photo of the night.